On every sugar plantation in the Caribbean and the American South, there was a machete kept beside the mill. It was not there for cutting cane. The cane had already been cut. Men and women had hacked it from the fields under the sun, bundled it, loaded it onto wagons, and carried it to the mill house where three massive vertical rollers stood in a frame, turning continuously, driven by wind, water, cattle, or steam. The rollers were the heart of the plantation. They crushed the cane and extracted the juice that would be boiled into sugar, shipped to Europe and New England, and sold for more money per pound than almost any other commodity on earth. The cane was fed into the rollers by hand. An enslaved worker stood at the mouth of the mill and pushed stalks of sugarcane between the first and second roller. The rollers caught the cane, crushed it flat, and pulled it through. The juice ran down into a collecting pan. The crushed fiber came out the other side and was fed back through the second and third roller to extract whatever juice remained. The worker fed the cane continuously, stalk after stalk, hour after hour, because the mill ran 24 hours a day during harvest season, and the cane had to be crushed within hours of cutting or the juice would ferment, the sugar would not crystallize, and the entire crop would be ruined. The worker was exhausted. The worker had been cutting cane since before dawn and feeding the mill since the shift changed. The harvest ran from January through May. There was no day off, no rest, and no possibility of slowing down, because the overseer stood behind the worker, and the overseer carried a whip. And the rollers did not stop. And if the worker's fingers slipped too far between the rollers while pushing a stalk through, the rollers caught the fingers the same way they caught the cane. They pulled the hand in, then the wrist, then the arm, and the machete beside the mill was there for this moment. Someone grabbed it and swung it at the arm before the body followed the hand into the rollers. If they were fast enough, the worker lost an arm and lived. If they were not fast enough, the worker was pulled between the rollers and crushed to death. If a mill feeder be caught by the finger, wrote Barbados plantation owner Edward Littleton in the 17th century, his whole body is drawn in and he is squeezed to pieces. Sugar was not like cotton or tobacco. Cotton and tobacco were harvested and shipped raw to distant markets, where they were processed into finished goods. Sugar had to be processed on the plantation where it was grown, immediately after harvest, or it was worthless. This meant that every sugar plantation was not just a farm but a factory, and the factory ran on the same labor force that worked the fields. The same enslaved men and women who spent the day cutting cane in 100-degree heat were rotated into the mill house and the boiling house at night, working shifts around the clock for the duration of the harvest, sleeping in fragments between shifts, eating on their feet, with no break in the cycle for 4 to 5 months. The mill was the first stage. The boiling house was the second. The juice that ran from the mill was carried through wooden troughs to a series of large copper kettles heated by furnaces below. Enslaved workers, many of them women, stood over the boiling kettles and ladled the thickening juice from one kettle to the next, each one hotter than the last, skimming the scum from the surface as the sugar concentrated. The kettles were open. The liquid inside was boiling. The steam rose in clouds that filled the boiling house with a heat so intense that the workers, already dehydrated from the fields, fainted beside the kettles. A splash of boiling sugar juice on exposed skin produced burns that went to the bone. A worker who stumbled or collapsed could fall into a kettle and be boiled alive. The boiler, a highly skilled enslaved man who determined when the juice had been sufficiently reduced, was one of the most valuable people on the plantation, because the quality of the sugar depended on his judgment, and his judgment depended on his being conscious and alert after 16 or 18 hours of standing beside kettles of boiling liquid in a room with no ventilation and no relief. The sugar mill was one of the oldest industrial machines in the New World. The technology originated in the Mediterranean and traveled to the Americas with the Portuguese, who established the first sugar plantations in Brazil in the 1550s. Colonel James Drax, a Barbados planter, visited Dutch Brazil in 1640 and purchased a triple roller sugar mill and a set of copper cauldrons. He brought them back to Barbados, and within a decade, sugar had transformed the island from a struggling tobacco colony into the richest piece of real estate in the English-speaking world. By the 1680s, Barbados was producing more wealth per acre than any other colony in the British Empire, and nearly all of that wealth was extracted from sugarcane, crushed in mills operated by enslaved Africans. The technology spread to Jamaica, to Saint Domingue, to Cuba, to the Virgin Islands, to every Caribbean island where the climate permitted sugarcane to grow. By the 18th century, the Caribbean sugar colonies were producing 80 to 90% of the sugar consumed in Western Europe. The scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic specifically to grow, cut, crush, and boil sugar. The death rates on sugar plantations were so high that the enslaved population could not sustain itself through natural reproduction. New captives had to be imported continuously to replace the dead. A sugar plantation did not merely use enslaved labor, it consumed it. The three-roller mill was an elegant piece of engineering and a perfect killing machine. The rollers were typically made of iron, mounted vertically in a heavy wooden or iron frame, geared together so that all three turned simultaneously when power was applied. The cane entered between the first and second roller, was crushed, emerged from the other side, and was then fed between the second and third roller for a second crushing. The gap between the rollers was adjustable, set just wide enough to accept the cane and just narrow enough to squeeze the juice from the fiber. The gap was not wide enough to accept a human hand. But the rollers did not stop when a hand entered the gap. The power source, whether wind, water, animal, or steam, continued to turn the rollers with a force designed to crush thick, fibrous cane stalks, and a human hand offered less resistance than a cane stalk. The arm followed the hand. The shoulder followed the arm. The rollers continued turning. The gearing that connected the three rollers meant that all three turned at the same speed at the same time, and anything caught between two of them was pulled through with the full force of whatever was driving the mill. On a wind-powered plantation, that was the force of a windmill with sails 30 feet across. On a steam-powered plantation, that was the force of an engine rated at dozens of horsepower. The worker feeding the mill had no kill switch, no emergency stop, no way to reverse the rollers. The only option was the machete. The practice of keeping a blade beside the mill was so universal that it was mentioned in planters' journals, in travelers' accounts, in the published descriptions of plantation life that circulated in Europe throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. It was not treated as a scandal. It was treated as a practical measure, a sensible precaution, like keeping a bucket of water beside a fire. The amputation was performed by whoever was closest, often another enslaved worker, sometimes the overseer, sometimes the mill feeder's own partner, working beside them at the same machine. The stroke had to be fast, and it had to be placed correctly because the rollers were still turning and the arm was still being pulled in, and every second of delay meant the blade had to strike closer to the shoulder. Plantations across the Caribbean had one-armed men and women who had survived the mill. They were reassigned to lighter duties. Their injuries were recorded as economic losses, not as human tragedies, because the people who suffered them were property, and the damage to property was measured in currency, not in pain. The mill killed in the harvest season, and the harvest season was when the plantation made its money, and stopping the mill meant losing money, and the entire economic logic of the sugar plantation was built on the principle that the value of the sugar extracted in a season exceeded the cost of the labor consumed to extract it. The labor was enslaved. The cost of replacing a dead or maimed worker was the purchase price of a new one at auction. In the Caribbean in the 17th century, an enslaved person could be bought for as little as £7. By the 18th century, the price had risen to 40 or 50 pounds. In Louisiana, where sugar cultivation arrived after the Haitian Revolution of 1791, sent French planters fleeing to the American South, the price was higher because the United States banned the import of enslaved people from abroad in 1808, forcing plantation owners to buy from the domestic slave trade. Louisiana sugar masters imported enslaved people from Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, purchasing them at auction and marching them south in coffles to replace the sick, the maimed, and the dead. Former slave and memoirist Jacob Stroyer wrote that enslaved people saw Louisiana as a place of slaughter. When a train lurched out of a South Carolina station carrying enslaved people to Louisiana, the colored people cried out with one voice as though the heavens and earth were coming together. And it was so pitiful that those hard-hearted white men who had been accustomed to driving slaves all their lives shed tears like children. Solomon Northup, the free black New Yorker kidnapped into slavery in 1841, described the sugar harvest in Louisiana in his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. "The hands are not allowed to sit down long enough to eat their dinners," he wrote. "Carts filled with corn cake are driven into the field at noon. The cake is distributed by the drivers and must be eaten with the least possible delay. The workers cut cane from before dawn until after dark, fed the mill through the night, and returned to the fields at first light. The pace was set by the machinery. The steam-powered mills of Louisiana could process cane faster than hand-powered or animal-powered mills in the Caribbean, which meant the cutters had to cut faster, the feeders had to feed faster, and the boilers had to boil faster, and the acceleration of the machinery produced a corresponding acceleration of human suffering. Mechanization sped up the tempo across the plantation, making it harder for slaves who cut the cane by hand to keep up with the demands of the mill. Haste, fatigue, and lengthening work hours heightened the risk of accident already endemic on the plantations. It was death to those who worked at the mill," said Henry Goings, an enslaved witness to the Louisiana sugar harvest. He was not speaking metaphorically. The sugar mill killed the people who fed it with a regularity that was understood by everyone involved, from the planter who owned the machine to the enslaved man who stood beside the rollers and pushed cane between them with his bare hands, while a machete hung from a nail on the frame within arm's reach, waiting for the moment when his fingers would not come back. The machine that sweetened the tea of every household in Europe and America for 3 centuries was powered by the bodies of the people who operated it, and it consumed them at a rate that required an entire continent to be emptied of its population and shipped across an ocean to keep the rollers turning. The sugar mill did not merely process cane, it processed human beings. It converted their labor into sugar and their bodies into waste. And it did this continuously, season after season, century after century, until the system that fed it was dismantled by war and revolution, and the slow grinding pressure of conscience that arrived, as conscience always does, long after the damage was done. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, subscribe. There are more machines like this one, and every one of them left a body count the world forgot.